Let's talk about the double-sided shame of talking about the grief and the confusion of your narcissistic relationship. One thing we know in the world of mental health is talking through our stuff helps, and it matters. Sometimes just releasing uncomfortable feelings and thoughts, getting perspective, and if you're fortunate, hopefully getting a little validation, being seen, being heard. And this is where things get tricky for folks in toxic or narcissistic relationships, because the patterns in these relationships are confusing. To many people, they just sound like relationship problems that are run-of-the-mill. And since the narcissistic person often presents quite well in the world, the people you turn to may also be dubious about your situation. So it creates a double bind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. So let's talk about the first kind of shame. The shame we feel when we talk about it. Many people say that they feel deeply disloyal when they talk about what is happening in their narcissistic relationship. Because unless there are big ticket things going on in the relationship, like cheating or physical abuse or financial abuses, the stuff that happens in these relationships is almost hard to articulate. It's hard to talk about being gaslighted or manipulated with someone who doesn't get it. And the pushback people get often is, well, maybe you misheard them, or they have their reality too, or don't make such a big deal out of it. Devaluation can sound like regular relationship stuff that people go through, and especially because the conundrum of many narcissistic relationships is that every day is not terrible, and the narcissistic person can often trick the world. We may not only have a hard time talking about why we are having such a hard time, but we may also be so caught up in the rationalizations and trauma bonding and all of it that we feel like bad people talking about it, and may really feel as though we are the ones who are engaging in betrayal when we even consider using language like narcissistic and manipulative and gaslighting. This applies no matter what kind of narcissistic relationship we are in. And in fact, lots of folks experience even more shame when it is a family member, and especially a parent. So the one thing that can be useful, even when people come to therapy, can magnify the shame. This issue of feeling disloyal when talking about the narcissistic person in your life is a common one. The thought that you are being dismissive for even thinking about them this way, and that maybe you are the hard-hearted one for having this perspective. And while we know that having support and people you can turn to get validated, that the patterns in your relationship are indeed unhealthy, and that what that person did or said is not okay, is in fact how people heal. Shame is such an uncomfortable, isolating feeling, and one that is often evoked when we talk about our narcissistic relationships. And this is how people get stuck. For so many people in narcissistic relationships, you can sort of get lost in your own private climate, where criticism and cruelty and betrayal and devaluation and dismissiveness are all normalized. And we slowly get into a place where we do not take notice of these behaviors as a problem anymore. Emotional abuse becomes our normal. But there is a second shame, which is the shame that festers in us when we don't talk about it. The narcissistic abuse gets distorted within us, and we believe that we are not enough, that we are the ones who are doing the bad thing, and this seeps into our identity. The relationship steals us from ourselves, and the shame for many survivors comes from this unprocessed sense that we've given up on ourselves. But it's a war between our true identities, our true selves, and the self we have to maintain, the self we have to be to maintain an attachment or a relationship with the toxic person. While we can intellectually recognize that we did and said, and our sympathetic nervous system took the reins so we could stay in a relationship, which is a critical human need, there is still a deep shamed part of ourselves. And not only do we view ourselves as disloyal and all the rest of it for thinking bad thoughts about the narcissistic person, but we also feel as though we failed somehow as people and not finding our voices or being ourselves or even giving up on ourselves, but don't recognize that that is the ultimate transaction of the narcissistic relationship. Love means becoming what they want and sacrificing ourselves. Even BS fairy tales like The Little Mermaid, for example, sold that to us as what love is. It's quite messed up. The second shame, though, is not so much the shame of not sharing, but the shame that builds up in us when we don't receive empathy, compassion, being seen, and learning that what is happening to us is not okay, and simultaneously having to give up on ourselves to make it all work, which drives that shame. But those two shames, the shame of sharing and the shame of not sharing, it's not like it's a real choice. And some folks go back and forth between the two. And it can be made even worse when you do share and are shamed by others for sharing, and then go silent again, and find yourself sliding deeper into the sense of, what is it about me? What's wrong with me? And you know I'm going to say, it's not you. Giving voice to your experience, even if that means seeing someone clearly and accurately, as uncomfortable as that is not disloyal, nor is it a betrayal. It's reality. And reality is an essential ingredient to healing. I'm a firm believer that healing from narcissistic abuse best happens in groups, when survivors can hear and talk with other survivors, who are really the only people in the world who completely get it. Therapy is important too, has to be with a therapist who gets it, because many survivors are often struggling with other stuff like anxiety, depression, and other expectable symptoms that are related to the harms and traumas of the relationship. But ultimately, it happens collectively. The shame starts to lift when you realize you are not alone, and that you can clearly see that another person's mother or brother or partner is narcissistic as they share what is happening. And that you can turn that insight back to yourself, or have someone validate, or just be present with what has happened to you. Shame is that voice that keeps us stuck. Compassion, empathy, and validation are the ways that we can feel safe again, so we can release that persecuting shame voice and give permission to our reality and psychological safety. And that takes a minute to happen. Thanks again.